I want to welcome everyone. This is a very special event in UROC's continuing critical conversations, the series of discussions we have that we are so happy to see a mix of community and university folks here to enjoy. This particular conversation, the bright sunshine of human rights, Hubert Humphrey and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, is actually in recognition of Constitution Day. It's also known as Citizenship Day, a federal observance that recognizes the adoption of the U.S. Constitution and those who have become U.S. citizens. Constitution Day is normally observed on September 17th, and we've chosen to honor that day with this evening's event and its companion exhibit, which will continue through January 30th into 2015 here in the UROC Gallery. And it's a spectacular series of photos and memorabilia, so we're so thrilled to have that. Both event and exhibit were produced in partnership with the university's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, the Office for Public Engagement, and Office of the Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost. On that note, I'd like to recognize a couple of special guests we have with us this evening. Our Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost, Karen Hansen, was going to try and be here this evening. I don't believe that she's made it as of yet, but we want to thank her anyway. We have with us our Senior Vice President, Andy Furco, our University of Minnesota Associate Vice President for Public Engagement, and both of these folks are incredibly important to this and all events here at UROC. Andy, thank you very much. We have with us Representative Raymond Dean. And we couldn't do anything here at UROC without you either, Raymond. So thank you all for being here. But I just wanted to point out these folks and appreciate all the things that you do for UROC and for North Minneapolis. This evening's event will begin with a welcome from Eric Schwartz, Dean of the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, who will introduce our distinguished speakers. After their comments, UROC's Director of Community Outreach, Makeda Zulu Gillespie, who we also could not do without, will moderate, there we are, an open question and answer session on Hubert Humphrey and the legacy of the U.S. Civil Rights Act. On your way out this evening, please feel free to take a free copy of this book, When Democracy Worked, Reflections on the Passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by John G. Stewart. The book is a really fascinating look at Stewart's experience as legislative director to Senator Humphrey. And before I introduce Dean Schwartz, I do want to say none of this could happen without the remarkable staff of UROC. So if you are UROC staff out in the lobby or here, would you please stand? So there's the executive director and then there's the people, right? So here we have it. Thank you very much. And now I'm pleased to introduce Eric Schwartz, Dean of the University of Minnesota's Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Prior to his appointment at the university, Dean Schwartz served as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration, the principal humanitarian position in the U.S. Department of State. He also served at the United Nations as the UN Secretary General's Deputy Special Envoy for Tsunami Recovery after the Asian tsunami of 2004, and at the White House as Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs during the Clinton administration. Is that all you got? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dean Schwartz.
Thank you, Heidi, for that very warm welcome, and thank you all for coming. What an honor it is for us to be involved in this event tonight. We take the legacy of the namesake of our public affairs institution, the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, very seriously. We believe that we have an obligation at the school to ensure that our curriculum, our focus, our strategies embody the spirit of of the values that animated the professional and political life of Hubert H. Humphrey. And I think more so than probably most, if not all, graduate schools of public affairs around the country, Hubert Humphrey is sort of a presence at the school. I was a proud graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs, a similar school at Princeton University. And I can tell you, we didn't think very much about Woodrow Wilson while I was there. Not that we had anything against Woodrow Wilson, but I think the role that Hubert Humphrey plays in that institution, at the Humphrey School, is quite significant. And so for us, the anniversary of the passage and an enactment of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a very important anniversary. And we've sought to commemorate that date with a series of events. I think perhaps most notably, we had a wonderful visit by President Clinton in June, where he spent a great deal of time with our community, reflecting on the progress achieved and the challenges ahead with respect to the objectives of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Issues like inclusion, diversity, having an institution in which reflects the changing character of our society and the society into which our students are going to enter when they leave our school is very important to us. And so again, it is a great pleasure and an honor for the Humphrey School to be involved in this event tonight. So without further ado, let me introduce our three presenters. To my immediate left is Paul Stone. As a faculty member at the Humphrey School, I think Paul can fairly lay claim to the informal keeper of our Humphrey, many elements of our Humphrey tradition, and I think he spent some time in the Humphrey archives recently as well. He is a historian who is, I think, as you will hear, quite passionate about Hubert Humphrey's role in civil rights history. Paul teaches courses at the Humphrey School on the American West, on the Civil War and Minnesota history, as well as courses and seminars on American institutions and the conceptual foundation of Republican government. He is a native of Texas, and we have forgiven him his association with the state that is the host of the home of the LBJ School, which, you know, there's a certain amount of friendly rivalry between the Humphrey School and the LBJ School. But we have told Paul that he should feel free to visit the LBJ School and do research at the library, which I think he has done anyway. He probably would have done it with or without our permission. But as a native of Texas, he's worked as a journalist for Congressional Quarterly and a legislative aide in the U.S. House of Representatives. He's a graduate of Harvard and received his doctorate in American history from Yale. Our second panelist, Reatha Clark King, the daughter of sharecroppers in rural Georgia. She began her education in a one-room schoolhouse. By the time she was conducting research for her PhD in chemistry some 50 years ago, I understand that she began to consider herself a citizen of the world. She is the first was the first African-American female chemist for the National Bureau of Standards. She is that certainly merits applause. She is a former president and CEO of General Mills, the General Mills Foundation, and the former president of Metropolitan State University. She is the current chairwoman of the board of the National Association of Corporate Directors. She's known as a leader in philanthropy in the Twin Cities, as an educator, a tireless volunteer, having served on boards of directors for dozens of companies and nonprofit organizations locally and nationally. To my far left is Representative Donald Fraser, or Mayor Donald Fraser, whichever you care, whichever title you care to use. The Honorable Donald Fraser, born in Minneapolis, son of former University of Minnesota Law School Dean Everett Fraser. He's a former mayor of, a former Minnesota State Senator, U.S. Representative, and mayor of Minneapolis. During 4 terms as mayor, he helped redefine the role of the mayor in relation to the city council and initiated numerous programs to improve the lives of children in this city. As a congressman, perhaps his greatest area of impact was in foreign relations and human rights. He served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He was the chair of the Subcommittee on International Organizations, and he initiated the first comprehensive study of U.S. foreign policy and international human rights. He authored several laws requiring the U.S. government to give greater attention to human rights. And I can say as a college student in the mid-1970s, I saw, well before I got to know or even meet Donald Fraser, I think I and many other people, many other students who were college students who were deeply interested in international human rights, well understood that the integration of human rights in foreign policy didn't start with Jimmy Carter, but rather started with Congressman Don Fraser and others on Capitol Hill who during the mid-70s pushed and prodded Henry Kissinger and the Ford administration on these issues. So for me, it was just such a pleasure to come to Minneapolis and get to meet and spend time with Representative Don Fraser. So with that, I'm going to turn, I think I'm supposed to now turn the floor over to our panelists, and I'll make my way to the audience and with you all enjoy the presentations. Thank you.
I believe it falls upon me to begin, and I'll defer any comments relative to Texas until perhaps the question and answer session. Just as I'm a historian, but I'd like to think of myself still, since the topic is human rights, as a human being, and as a historian, I'm a humanist. And I think that what's critically important in the study of culture, society, and history right now is human beings. I don't believe in abstract forces that are neither alive nor dead, sort of like the ring wraiths chasing Frodo that run across the landscape. I believe in real human beings, men and women. And in fact, I will talk about Hubert Humphrey in that regard as well. A historical moment just before Memorial Day this year, the New York Times Book Review on the front page featured 3 new volumes that came out that examined more or less specifically the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And all 3 of them dealt with greater or larger patterns of American histories. Most all of them touched in some way on the Civil War, which is absolutely appropriate, but more specifically they focused on the importance of what was happening 100 years after the Civil War in the 1960s. I'm happy to say that I am old enough to remember it very well and can remember some of these events, the Democratic National Convention, seeing images of what you've seen out in the foyer being signed. One of the things that struck me, and it's been so wonderful to work with the people at UROC in this, and especially Juan, I want to thank you for the pleasure of working with you, because this whole period is very kaleidoscopic, and you can only appreciate it in terms of these images. And I think that the context being images that Americans began to see with the television age that affected science, technology, prosperity after World War II, inequality of conditions, especially of citizenry, and images that had to do with constitutionalism in some very basic function. And I think that by the time we get to the campaign of 1960, which I'm always amazed that I tell students what their reaction is, that it was a bigger issue, it was a more vituperative issue having a Roman Catholic elected president of the United States in 1960 than having a black man elected president in 2008. And I still think that that's very important. We shouldn't dance around that kind of notion. But the image of John F. Kennedy at his inauguration, he didn't wear a top hat. He didn't like hats because they sort of squished down that beautiful head of hair that he had. And that's really the reason. In fact, the men's haberdashery changed. Hats went out of vogue for that time. And we have, in fact, one of Hubert's hats here. But images of the new frontier, this optimism, the space age, the jet age. Started by 1962, the civil rights movement had been certainly nationally known since the mid-50s, but by 1962, the image of peaceful protest being violently suppressed, of articulation, it wasn't just visual, it was auditory too. And when we think about how much it means to us to hear words, to hear language, we the people, that kind of thing. It's an age that even though it's 50 years ago, it's very close to us. Tied into that, the image which I think strikes so many people of a motorcade in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, of a woman crawling across the back of the trunk, trying to pick up a piece of her husband's head. Only a few hours later, a swearing in on Air Force One, Judge Sarah T. Hughes swearing in Lyndon Johnson as president. It's emotional. It's an emotional time. 5 days after that, this new president addressing a joint session of Congress in probably unarguably his best speech, saying no other memorial to John F. Kennedy could suffice rather than a speedy passage of a comprehensive civil rights bill. That is stating the importance of history yet to happen. Now, I don't have the time to go through this, but this is passed by, in fact, I use the metaphor of the jet age. People were starting to think that if you use the jet age metaphor, we were thinking of a 3-engine jet. The only engine that in the federal government that had been operating toward a realization of civil rights and human rights was the courts. So we think of the Supreme Court, Brown versus Board of Education. Where was the engine of the executive? Where was the engine of the legislative? That was what started to happen. I'll say more during the question and answer at that time. But a configuration of mostly men. There were only 2 women in the Senate. There were only 5 black members of the House of Representatives at the time. Just think about 50 years difference for there. People who, in many cases, adored each other, people who were indifferent to each other, and people who couldn't stand each other, agreed on some commonality of meaningful, comprehensive legislation. So a major point that I'd like to make in this is that deals with constitutionalism. That deals with citizenry. That means that you assume that Americans will abide by the law, and they take law seriously. And it's a government of law. People make laws. Laws are human. Laws are organic. What happens when a huge portion of the population is not protected by law or is not able to make a voice? This isn't a racial issue. This is a constitutional issue which involves race and people on the most basic level. There's some smart things going on, and I say this by bringing us way to Hubert Humphrey, who Reatha and I were just talking before, who goes to Philadelphia in the summer of 1948. He's mayor of Minneapolis. He's only graduated from the University of Minnesota in 1939. He started in 1929. He had to drop out because of the Depression. My parents were children of the Depression. We can understand that. He comes back in 37, graduates in 39, and by God, by 1945, he's mayor of Minneapolis. In the summer of 1948, in an unair-conditioned auditorium in Philadelphia, he talks about, and this is where the title comes from, it is time for us and for the Democratic Party, for the United States and the Democratic Party, to step out of the shadow of states' rights into the bright sunshine of human rights. He doesn't have to say it. Now, he's lucky in a certain way because Strom Thurmond and the Dixiecrats bolt And it actually gives Truman the opportunity that he doesn't have to campaign for these votes. He can go for a senator. Hubert Humphrey is elected senator in 1948. And none other than Senator Russell from Georgia makes this audible snide to, can you imagine that the good citizens of Minnesota would send this idiot to the Senate? He has to overcome that. And along with sort of the smartness of it, by 1951, he's saying, you know, I'm the first DFL senator from Minnesota. It's not necessarily certain that I'm going to be reelected. And he takes a look around and he says, the person who probably run against me is Luther Youngdahl, who's a very popular centrist governor, and who's been the only one to support Harry Truman in his firing of Douglas MacArthur. And I understand that Youngdahl doesn't like being governor much anymore and wants to be a federal judge, and maybe I can get President Truman to appoint him. Now that's practical basic politics, right? So, you know, we're not talking about hagiography here. We're talking about a real world. So fast forward to 1963-64, Lyndon Johnson, after meeting with leadership, coming back to Washington, he's working in the White House, but he's not living in the White House yet. Now think about that significance of sort of working and living. Calls Hubert aside and says, Hubert, I desperately need you. I need you very badly in these matters. And Hubert's saying, yes, sir, Mr. President, you can count on me. Well, the fact is he can count on him. And Hubert Humphrey is appointed by Mike Mansfield as being the whip and sort of the floor manager. And he basically remembers two things that Johnson says to him before. He says, Hubert, one thing I don't like about you damn liberals is you can't count. And he also says, Hubert, you damn bomb throwers make great speeches, but you can't get bills passed. Now that's incredibly significant. And in fact, I think it goes against the kind of cynicism that we see far too often in society and in universities, I'm sorry to say. What happens is an organization which is not necessarily, it's not an airy-fairy, lovey-dovey bipartisan thing. It's looking at the fact that the Republican Party is still the party of Lincoln. And a Thomas Kuchel from California and possibly a Lincolnian like Dirksen are the keys to getting this work passed. And Johnson also says to Hubert, and he says, Hubert, I want you to drink with Dirksen. I want you to listen to Dirksen. I want you to stay with Dirksen as long as you want. I want to say what else he might have suggested. And he said, but this is the key. Now, that is, again, the practical real world that we live in terms of legislation. And it's also balancing what's going on in the House, which is probably a key figure there is Bill McCullough. The dean and I were just talking about it. Congressman from Ohio, not from a district sympathetic to civil rights, probably has less than a dozen black people in the district. And he basically says, this is the right thing to do. We need to get this. And I don't want to see it weakened in the Senate. Back and forth, we know that there's a filibuster. It's the longest filibuster in U.S. history. And as a Southerner, I can say that the legend was that the U.S. Senate was the South's revenge for Gettysburg. That's true, but it gets beaten. And the vote gets passed, and it goes back to the House, and it's signed. That was not an accident.
I think I'm second. So. I'm going to talk about Hubert Humphrey before he got to Washington to deal with the question of why or how did we know that Humphrey would become the principal leader in human rights when he arrived. I first met Humphrey in 1947. He was then the mayor of Minneapolis, and he was in his second term. I was active. I was a member of the law school student body and also active in a veterans group called AVC, the American Veterans Committee, where I had also met Orville Freeman, also a war veteran. Freeman, Humphrey, and a small group of political activists had merged the two somewhat left-leaning parts of the Democratic Party in 1944, the Farmer Labor Party and the organizationally weaker Democratic Party were merged together to form the DFL Party, Democratic Farmer Labor Party. That was in 1944. By 1947, a major fight was brewing over party leadership in Minnesota, and Humphrey was looking at the 1948 election for the United States Senate, hoping to defeat the Republican incumbent, Joseph Ball. Humphrey was also active in the national organization known as ADA, Americans for Democratic Action, led by Eleanor Roosevelt and Walter Reuther, who was president of the United Auto Workers. ADA had been formed to provide a new direction to the Democratic Party nationally after Roosevelt's death and Harry Truman became president. Humphrey was one of the leaders of this new group that included a number of people who were strong Democrats, but who were also actively opposed to efforts by left-leaning groups, including Communist Party members, aimed at influencing the National Party. ADA was actively pro-labor, had a strong commitment to end racial discrimination in the United States, and was dedicated to the success of the United Nations and a democratic foreign policy. The Cold War was not yet a foreign policy term, but it was an element in the 1948 fight for dominance in the Democratic Party nationally and in the DFL Party in Minnesota. But here we are today to talk about Humphrey's civil rights legacy. In 1945, in his inaugural address as mayor, Humphrey had called for passage of a fair employment ordinance to deal with job discrimination that Jews, African Americans, and American Indians faced in our city. Rejected by his city council, Humphrey turned to a well-known Lutheran minister, Reuben Youngdahl, and an activist Jewish woman, Viola Himes, to help build support for a fair employment practices ordinance. He was also helped by Cecil Newman, editor and publisher of the Minneapolis Spokesman, the African American newspaper, and a leader in the black community. In 1947, Humphrey was successful in getting an FEPC ordinance passed by the city council with a vote of 21-3. Minneapolis was one of a small handful of cities that had adopted such laws. It didn't hurt that in 1946, Carrie McWilliams, a nationally recognized journalist, had identified Minneapolis as one of the most anti-Semitic cities in the United States. This was in Common Ground, a monthly magazine. Humphrey was rapidly making a name for himself nationally. He was demonstrating and practicing his skills as an organizer and an orator on behalf of civil rights and other liberal legislation. Humphrey knew that one had to convince a public of the necessity and the rightness of legislation before it could be passed. But he also knew that the backing of a political party is vital in getting elected. By 1948, Henry Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture under Roosevelt, was leader of what was characterized as the left wing of the National Democrats. and ADA and Humphrey were called the right wing. In June of 1948, at the Minnesota DFL State Convention, a left-wing, right-wing fight developed. Orville Freeman was elected secretary of the party, and Humphrey was endorsed for the U.S. Senate and went off to the National Democratic Party Convention, where, with ADA help, he got on the platform committee. And there he led the fight for a strong civil rights plank in the party platform and delivered his famous "Out of the shadow of states' rights and into the bright sunshine of human rights," that which typified his speech. This minority report was adopted. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina led a walkout of Southern segregationists. The rest is history. I thought giving this bit of context and background on Humphrey as a civil rights leader would be a contribution to this panel on his leadership in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What Humphrey did was bring together leaders of different constituencies to acknowledge and publicize a problem and deal with it politically. He also led a whole new generation of liberal activists brought to politics by their experience as Depression-era children of the 1930s and as young World War II veterans, whether in military service or on the home front. Youngsters who saw government as a good, an institution that dealt with problems and events individuals could not deal with alone. In the 1948 civil rights fights in the DFL party and in the Humphrey campaign for the Senate that year, young people such as Fritz Mondale, myself, and many others were inspired and educated by Humphrey. He taught us that politics was a noble endeavor in which one respected and even collaborated with one's opponents.
So, how inspiring. Well, thank you very much. Thanks to my fellow panelists. Thanks to all of you for being here today. I feel truly honored to be sitting before you for a number of reasons. It is very rare that I have in the room my Sunday school teacher, my former professor from the University of, from the Humphrey Institute, and Bill English, whom I've worked with for many years, and so many of you that I have known and worked with, and I'm truly indebted to you for being able to sit here. I'm really feeling honored. I have Sunday school classmates in the room, so a lot of people to keep me honest. I want to thank my fellow panelists. I really feel inspired by what you have said, and I noted here that I thought I would be retooling my resolve to leave here and get to work, and that's just the way I feel at this time. I'm celebrating the life and great works of Senator Hubert Humphrey, former Vice President Hubert Humphrey, for a more personal reason than has been cited before. He had an influence on my getting to Minnesota. When I was interviewed for the presidency of Metropolitan State University in 1977, not sure that I would be selected, my husband encouraged me to go ahead and apply. And I said, what if I get offered the position? He said, well, we'll move. I think he was kidding. Anyway, I was offered the position. He was invited to make the trip with me to observe the final interview by the Wise State University Board. So when it came time for me to say yes or no, he realized he would have to give up his job as chair of the Department of Chemistry to be the trailing spouse. And it was very unusual at that time for a husband to be a trailing spouse for his wife to take a position elsewhere. So when his mom heard about my being offered the job, she told him, she said, buddy, you leave your job and go with Reatha, because no place where Hubert Humphrey lives is all that bad. She loved. His reputation had reached Birmingham, Alabama, so he was widely respected for his influence on civil rights and being such a strong, outspoken person on human rights for others. And so my husband believed in his mom, so with those two emotions working in my behalf, I didn't have to say another word. We came on to Minnesota. So it is thought-provoking for me to be with you today, and I've given a lot of thought to that movement, what stimulated it, because unlike Paul, I preceded the passage of the Civil Rights Act by quite a few years. And I know some of the incidents too well that inspired both Senator and Vice President Humphrey and our civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr. I'm struck by his challenging the system so early, a long time ago. 1948, that was a long time ago, much before the organized civil rights movement started. That is, the organized movement by Dr. King. So I thought to myself, along with the inspiration mentioned by the mayor that motivated Senator Humphrey, he must have realized that he was standing on the shoulders of giants as well. A. Philip Randolph and White, who's executive secretary of the NAACP, and even Dred Scott, who many years ago sued for his freedom and filed a suit with the Supreme Court. So I assume, like me, he was motivated by the fact that he was standing on the shoulders of giants. The bottom line viewpoint of my remarks is that while that he took that courageous stand and that speech before the Democratic Party in 1948, and with the work of Dr. King, that got us far along on the journey for human rights for our own citizens, blacks, minorities, women, others left out. And we have come far. We have made progress, but we have not finished the journey. In some ways, we have just begun. And I see that every day, every time I go to Washington, and I'm challenging the system to get more diversity on corporate boards. Well, when I was in South Georgia, even at Clark, Atlanta University, I didn't know what a corporate board was. So we are learning about new careers, new kinds of careers to be introduced to, and creating awareness on the part of our people about those careers and helping them learn how to prepare. So this is why I say, in some ways, we have just begun. My firsthand knowledge of the atrocities toward blacks that motivated Dr. King and other civil rights leaders before the act was passed is numerous. Born in 1938 and leaving for college in 1954, the bad treatment of blacks in the South provided Dr. King with vivid examples that he could use to shame America before God and the world to do better by blacks and all humankind, that we were offending by our practices. Now, I say shame the world before God. Being a good Baptist, you know I'm going to get the God thing in there, right? But I do read in Dr. King's speeches that he was mindful of God Almighty and how he was far more powerful than any of the people, the Southern, trying to keep us hostage to their tactics. And certainly, if you read the book by his colleagues, You will find the one who wrote An Easy Burden, you'll find his saying in there that one of their tactics was to get the attention of the media, to spotlight America's bad treatment by minorities and others before the rest of the world. How could we be leader of the free world and treat our own people that way? Now, Andrew Young wrote a clear presentation of their tactics. So this is why I stand by the belief that they were trying to get the attention of the rest of the world as well as the attention of our authorities in Washington. What were some of these bad tactics and practices toward us blacks that I observed in our community? Lynchings and unjust arrests of blacks, bad housing, economic deprivation, cheating shareholder families, which we were, and other blacks of our earnings, depriving us of schooling opportunities, gaps in educational services between blacks and whites, lack of good job opportunities, disrespect, valued only for our farm and domestic labor, unequal health care services, and the list goes on. Today, my hairdresser asked me if I had what did I think about the movie 12 Years as a Slave. And I said, I think what you saw there is very accurate, and it's just a sample of what happened. She said, oh my God. And she said, I couldn't see that movie but once. My husband saw it twice. But when I said it was just a sample of the atrocities that happened to us blacks, she couldn't quite believe it. So what we're seeing here between 1938 and 1954 is a list of disparities, gaps, differences in treatment between the races. Now these were, as you know, sanctioned by the laws, enforced by law enforcement people, mandated to keep order and make sure that we blacks obeyed the law, would be punished if we actually disobeyed or were suspect of disobeying the law. Now that's hurtful, suspect of disobeying the law. So we blacks in the South at that time worried about two things, both the laws, which were probably easier to change than to change the behaviors of the policemen and the law enforcement people. We are still dealing with the latter problem today. And we are still dealing with that, yet we have changed the laws. So that is, and I see in Dr. King's writing a mindfulness of that problem. Pass the laws, but we gotta go a step further. I would say that I saw Ferguson in Missouri, an example of that. We've changed the laws, but now we got to change the behaviors of the enforcement of those laws. So we fear two things: discrimination under the law, and the law enforcement itself. So fast forward, 1954, Brown versus Topeka, first year in college at Clark College for me. 1958, fermentation toward the civil rights movement. Now, it hadn't happened, but there was a lot of activism that would lead us to see that we had set the grounds for an organized movement. There was a lot of activity, but it wasn't organized the way Dr. King did it. Then we had 1960 sit-ins, and then desegregation of the services. And I got married in 61, and during that year, Rich's department store was desegregated throughout. And that was, and Judge and I went back, I from Chicago, he went from Atlanta University, and enjoyed the privilege that those students had brought about by their protests. So we can credit Dr. King and also Mr. Humphrey to some extent with organizing a movement that was different from this scattered activity that had been taking place many years before. So my time is up, but I want to quickly say we moved on from 63 when so much happened, it was such a combustible environment when we lived in Washington. Moved to D.C. in January, judging graduate school with my working. The March on Washington happened that year. Kennedy assassination happened. The Civil Rights Act was, and the Voting Rights Acts were passed, 64 and 65. The Poor People Campaign Against Poverty, organized by Reverend Jesse Jackson. So the spotlight was put on poverty. And then 1968, the King assassination, and then that same year, Bobby Kennedy assassination. And we cannot mistake the fact that there was some other very exciting things that were happening. We were putting a man on the moon. We had a rat race with the Russian to do the research to put a person on the moon. I was a rocket scientist at the National Bureau of Standards, just burning up everything, it seems, trying to find that fuel to put a person on the moon. So, but feelings were very raw, because just as we got that person on the moon, then the Vietnam War exploded. And on the campus where I went to teach, I was trying to bring order, and I quickly was labeled an Uncle Tom. And whites who were sympathetic toward blacks were labeled the N-word. That's how raw feelings were. And then that laid the ground for the women's movement, which really helped me get the job in Minnesota, because two things were working in my behalf. No minorities in the state university system, presidency, and and few women presidents in public colleges and universities. So the women's movement broke loose and piggybacked on the civil rights movement. So over the next 30 years, we had the first black here, the first black there, making us think that, oh, we are making great progress. Tiger Woods in golf, and Jameson in astronauts, corporate CEOs, medicine, and presidency of an Ivy League institution, Brown University, Ruth Simmons. That begs another question, though. How much progress have we made? We really made. We made a lot, but not enough. We are haunted by disparities and the gaps. And the laws have changed and has helped us progress, but unequally. Today we have disparities in education. We have a widening economic gap amongst our people and the rich and the poor. We have health disparities. We have income gaps. We have disrespect for citizens. There's unevenness in that. Poor people aren't respected well enough. I have gone downtown in some of our service offices and wondered, who are you talking to, as I observed the way people are talked to and treated. Housing, disparities there. Poverty, we still have a huge problem there. So we have made progress, but it's so unevenly distributed. And the other thing is unevenness in the power and influence of our voices. Hopelessness. Now, I think our churches can help with that. We were dirt poor in the Deep South, but we were never hopeless. And we were never hopeless. So that is, but when we see hopelessness and despair today, that's the problem. That's the problem. People are ready to give up. Okay, now I would, so the two gaps that worry me the most are the achievement gaps in schools, and we've had a lot of documentation that that's real, and the hopelessness that we see in some segments of our own population. And it also bothers me that we are not using a key tool that Dr. King helped to give us, and that is the vote. She stood up, showed her, I voted. Now, that's one of the tools that he left us with from the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act had an influence. That's a tool we could use, but we are underusing that tool. And this is a nice advertisement for Tuesday. Get out the vote and turn the ballot on the other side. Be sure you do that. And but if we don't use the tools at our disposal, and that's a good example of one, that's our fault. The most respect we could give Mr. Humphrey, Dr. King, and these giants whose shoulders we are standing is to use the tools we have. So I have exceeded my time. I apologize, Mr. Timekeeper. You know what you do when you exceed your time? You start looking the other way. You don't look at the timekeeper. You notice that trick? Okay, but thank you so very much. But we are standing.
Let's give them one more hand. You know, we started, I know we're in the Q&A, I see hands already, but we have meeting, ma'am. Oh, I need the mic. I thought I projected really well. But we had some truth telling today. And so, you know, I know a lot is on our mind and we want to pop right into the questions, but I have a plant that I want to ask someone a question before we get started. And so, Dr. Barajas, I heard that Humphrey was a hero of yours, and I wanted to know if you wanted to share why.
So yeah, I did. When the planning was going on for this and people were saying they were learning so much from Professor Stone about Humphrey, I said, well, what do you mean you're learning? I said, I'm from Southern California and Humphrey's a huge hero of mine. And they were like, well, how can that be? And so I finally did figure it out. And that is that I was born in 54. So we can do the math on that, right?
Yeah.
And so in 64, I was 10 years old. But TV was also now bringing people's speeches to us. And I remember watching the Democratic primary one year when Humphrey spoke. And I was in such awe that he talked about people and about equality. And I remember being moved to tears, and I was 10 years old or 11, something around there. And I went to my mom and I said, why am I upset? And so she went to the drawer and she pulled out her birth certificate. And she said, look at my birth certificate and tell me what's interesting about it. I said, well, why does it say under race, MEX, M-E-X, period? And she said, that's why Hubert Humphrey moved you. And she didn't explain it. It took me many years later to understand that in most of the states in the United States, when my parents were married in the early 50s, my father was white and my mother was Mexican, and they were not able to marry in all states. And it wasn't for years later that I understood that Hubert Humphrey loved people and he really loved this country. So I'm always brought to tears when I think about him.
Well, there's two more giants that I want to mention tonight. And one was a consultant to Hubert Humphrey, and she'd have been here if she could, and that's Nellie Stone Johnson.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
yeah. And then the other giant would be Malcolm X. And I think that his morality, and I do mean that, and his honesty, and his stamina, and his sacrifice are not to be overlooked. And I encourage anyone and everyone to revisit the autobiography of Malcolm X. And don't just read some of it, but read to the end, because before he was done, he said, I count my friends today among Jews and Christians and Muslims and atheists and agnostics. And he said, the only thing that is going to solve our problems is our earnest humanism.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for coming.
Please say your
tonight.
name also.
My name is Howard Ellis, and I want to say to Ms. King, you had a very big influence on the younger people in my family. You might know David, for one, David Ellis, who now was really influenced by you, who now is in education and has a school and is doing a lot, and my younger sister. But I wanted to say that we talked about the laws, and we talked about how we've come this far, and yet it seems like they're still not being respected by everyone. And I would like to say that I think one of the reasons why that is because, like in the 60s and in Martin Luther King's effort, the community was so deeply involved in everything. And I don't think that's the same today. I think there's a lot that's happening that especially the African American community is not necessarily totally involved in. How can you have an election and have such a poor turnout in this community from the African American community? It's so important for us to be politically involved. Politics is where change is made. And we need to be totally involved and aware of that. I appreciate everything that's being done. I appreciated all of the efforts of Humphrey. I do think he had a very big influence on what happened in this country in the very early years. But I think a lot of what needs to be done has to come from the African American community today, and we have to take it seriously.
My name is Peyton, and this is for Clark King. What do you remember the most about the civil movement, right movement?
Could you repeat it a little louder?
What do you remember the most about the civil rights movement?
Oh, the question is, what do I remember most about the civil rights movement? I'm thinking of between 1957 and 65. I think it was the day after the March on Washington. This was August 1963. And I picked up the New York Times, and it was a big headline, and I have a copy, a blown-up copy that Target had distributed at an event here that says 200,000 assembled at the on the mall, and it was orderly. That word orderly is a loaded word. Because several people had discouraged the march. You recall they had approached the Southern Christian Leadership Team and Bayard Rustin, the organizer, and tried to discourage it because they feared that there would be disorder if the march went forward. And so that word orderly speaks of their apprehension of the day. And that makes me so proud. Now, and my husband was at the march. On the day of the march, at 1 p.m., my supervisor came into the lab at the National Bureau of Standards and said to me, "I bet you want to be downtown, don't you?" I was right. This was Dr. Armstrong, George Armstrong. He was white. But he sensed how torn I felt being in the lab and didn't have the day off. So he was excusing me to go to the march. I went downtown, and I couldn't get blocks within blocks and blocks of the mall. But my husband had gone there earlier, and he was right up front, as he would be, those of you who know him. It's interesting, when President Kennedy was assassinated, the Bureau had not closed, but Dr. Armstrong appeared in the lab. I was at the bench, and at 1 o'clock, he said, "The Bureau is closed. Everybody's excused to go home." That's when, after President Kennedy had been shot in Dallas. Now, that was in November, after, the march. But, so I think about now, those two moments when Dr. Armstrong would appear in the lab at 1 o'clock. Maybe on other days, if he came in at 1 o'clock, I'd probably say, "What you want now?" Those were big times. Those were big moments in our history. But to answer your question, thanks for asking. Is it your name again? Beatty? Peyton. Peyton. Oh, are beautiful. Oh, like Walter Payton. Oh, no. That was, what grade are you in?
Third.
Third. Gosh. Oh, you're in the right place. The right place. Thank you for being here. Oh, he did. Oh, my. Well, I have to come and have a conversation with you. I can tell you all the history you don't want to know, probably, but those were big moments. Another big moment to me was when Martin Luther King Jr. came to Rockefeller Chapel at the University of Chicago and preached a sermon. We had chapel every Sunday, and I was in chapel every Sunday. I lived right across the road in a dorm, and he was the speaker. And oh, what a thrilling moment that was. He was a namesake. His family was about Morehouse campus all the time where my husband went. My family, I went to Clark, and that was Reverend Joe Lowry's family's school. And his family, they were so well known on those campuses, but it's sort of like hallowed ground. Being down there, walking where they walked. And, there was some other high points around the civil rights movement. I mentioned the Poor People's Campaign. All the drama that caused around Washington, and you probably recall.
Dr. Reatha?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you or make a point. You mentioned two colleges before we go to another question. You mentioned Clark and you mentioned Morehouse. What types of schools are those, if you could share with Peyton so that he would understand?
These are in the category of what we call historically black colleges, and they are a cluster of 6 now in Atlanta, Georgia. It would be a wonderful opportunity for you to visit them, Peyton, and just see those campuses. But many, and these colleges were founded by churches. Clark was founded by a Methodist church. Morehouse was founded by the Baptists. And Spelman, I think, was just founded by the rich Rockefellers. I think they have Baptists. Morris Brown, AME. And they were founded typically for the children of slaves. So they're older, and Clark was just a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for me. I left my hometown of Moultrie, Georgia, and at age 16 in the back of the Trailway bus. Seating was not integrated then, and this was before Rosa Parks took her stand in Montgomery. So I was with my footlocker. My mother put me on the bus and said, "Don't move out of your seat." And so that was the way I traveled between Moultrie, my hometown, 225 miles in Atlanta to get to college. But that was a wonderful experience for me. Within about a week, I had washed all the cotton-picking dirt off my body. And I felt I had achieved a magnificent dream for my whole community. to be able to go to that college. We had 800 students, and I had a job in the registrar's office and as a transcript person, and 12 hours per week, 35 cents an hour. So it was quite a story. Every day there was a story. It was so. Then I went from there to the University of Chicago in 1958. But it would be wonderful if you could visit those schools. In addition to the colleges now, they have a Morehouse College of Medicine right on nearby. And in the 6th, I counted that one in. Morehouse College of Medicine. It wasn't there when I was there, but and my husband and I got married on Morehouse's campus in 1961 by the then famous Dr. Benjamin Mays, who was and he was quite a mentor to both of us. So that's my husband's school. So it's wonderful that you are interested in knowing about these things, because this is you can make some plans for yourself. You can set your goals right now to attend one of those schools, or even better, attend similar schools. But it was so stimulating.
Thank you. We're on this side. We're going to come back to this side.
Hi, I'm Judy. I just wanted to respond to Mr. Ellis's point around the importance of exercising our rights and our responsibility to vote. I did want to just add that to me, it's very important to, this is going to probably sound in a way, I'm just going to say it. It's important to not blame people who have been historically disenfranchised or had those rights taken away if they're not showing up to the polls, if that makes sense. So if there's a certain group of people who are just somehow just not making it out, who are just not coming to these, who's not showing up to the polls, chances are we can look back historically and see why those sorts of things are happening. Myself, I'm a local Minneapolisan. I'm here, I'm from here, but I come from sharecroppers. My grandfather was from Clarksdale, Mississippi. So we hear stories about Fannie Lou Hamer all the time and the work that she did, and this is people who we grew up learning about. So knowing that there are many, many groups who tried their best to get their foot in their way in the door, to only be told no many times and to only be told that doesn't work many times. It makes sense to me why my peers may not show up in numbers like we should. And I'm more so invested in finding ways to invite people to these conversations. I'm here because I heard about it on the radio and it seemed like a pretty good thing. I'm a student at the University of Minnesota. I saw anything there. I'm in Humphrey every day to walk to, what am I saying? What's Blagan? Sorry. I use the Skyway to get to Blagan every day. But I think that inviting more people that fit into that category of those who are underrepresented to have these conversations is going to be the make or break of who shows up next Tuesday. So, I mean, that's just my play. And that's no disrespect to anybody. I'm sure that any one of the panelists can attest to the same and have probably many more statistics than I could probably remember around how that makes sense. But that's just, how I feel about it. But yeah, thank you.
Sounds like a future conversation.
Yeah,
Ongoing.
I think it does.
Yes, sir.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank the panel. It was a wonderful presentation. I guess my question to both Dr. Stone and Don Fraser. Pardon? My name is Bill English. But more important, I would like to know what you thought about Title VII of the '64 Civil Rights Act. We talk about economic disparities. And I found that Title VII had a great impact on where we are today and the progress that we've made, but more importantly, it has a great impact on the workforce today. Because what has happened is Reatha talked about the bringing of women into the gender discrimination was disallowed by that act. And I just want to know your thoughts about how we can utilize the results that we achieved under Title VII and make a difference in going forward in the future, given the income disparity that exists today. When the CEO makes 700 and some times more than an average worker, something is wrong with that picture. And we've got the 99%. We really are there. And when 1% of the wealth in this country is controlled by all of the other population, and the wealth is mostly controlled by the 99%. We are the 99%, and the 1% really controls the economy. So my question is, how can we use, is there additional legislation needs, but how do we attack this problem that was pointed out, that moved this country forward in terms of people of color and income?
And this will be our last question.
Don, did you want to respond first? Or?
I'll let you go on.
Well, I would hesitate to answer in a prescriptive way, but I will answer historically that the three books that I mentioned, all of which emphasize the debate over Title VII more than anything else, and also the number of amendments. So between the middle part of April and the middle part of June, the amendments were very worried about, in fact, what the power of the federal government was going to be, how much emphasis the federal government would push toward economic equality. And this was almost more of an issue than the enforcement aspects going forward. One of the things that I would say, I would push it back historically then, and to Hubert, one of the things about Hubert Humphrey was that he was from South Dakota. His father was a small businessman, meaning he was a pharmacist, and he became a pharmacist too. And he was of a progressive legacy. And so by progressive, I mean these were people who took expertise very seriously, and took accreditation and training and these other kinds of things seriously, and thought they had very real economic consequences. So there was no, again, airy fairyland, I think, in Humphrey's mind and the other people who were proponents of a strong Title VII there. But I don't know whether the flaw, the worm in the apple, was always there, which is a question of sort of the federal government and how much the federal government could be doing. I just spoke to an old friend who's chairman of the former chairman of the Republican Party in Massachusetts, who is still, he's hardly a Tea Partier, but he's very a local person, states and localities. So I think it's always coming into that kind of issue. And again, I would encourage us to think we're in a certain part of the city of Minneapolis in the state of Minnesota. And, you know, there are these local issues which are always going to be pertinent as opposed to federal issues. And I realize you weren't asking a federal thing, but it's a federal bill, so.
Well, I think the raising minimum wage, trying to ensure that people who do work get paid at a level that makes it possible for them to live decently. These are largely federal issues, and we need more political support in Congress to enact laws that will make that happen.
I think, may I see progress being made state by state. If you look at the position Governor Dayton's have taken on raising the minimum wage, and the debates that's gone on within our state. That's just a sample of the debates that will go on nationally. Also, and I think it's positive for us to have these debates and raise this issue locally and statewide. But I see a role for the nonprofits, like the Urban League, especially, to push this agenda. around the federal laws or just wherever they can. And the women activists, Betty Folliard lives in our building, and she is pushing the attention to the Equal Rights Amendment. You know, that expires. That temporary provision that they put in expires, I think, this year. And she organized a bus group to go to Washington from Minnesota. And several of us donated to that. But I think that's going to be pressuring the issue of women, the income gap for women. And it probably, to get legislative attention, you got to put in all underserved groups. But I think those groups have a voice and can give this issue a voice in Washington and at the state level. That issue of the question of having a voice so that you won't be ignored, that's hugely important in my opinion. Having a voice, giving people voice. That's what the Hawthorne Huddle did. That's right. It wasn't the money from the foundation that was so significant, but it was to give the neighborhood a voice that would be heard. And when we needed the CEO's voice, we asked for it. But that was to meet with the governor. But we wanted the involvement of the neighborhood, giving people a voice and backing them so that they won't be reluctant to use that voice or their voice. Most lower-income people underestimate their influence that they could have. You understand why they feel that way. They're so often disregarded. But if you show up at the polls, your vote counts just as much as others. Now, I didn't trust absentee ballot because I want my vote counted on that day. Unlike you, so I made the decision to go to the polls, and I weighed that whether to absentee. Civic engagement is important. So many people don't go out, Mr. Ellis, and participate because they think they're involving themselves in politics. Let's make a distinction between public policy and politics. All of us are affected by public policies. All of us drive on the roads, we breathe air, we benefit from public policies being passed by the political process. We don't have to be partisan, nonpartisan, or what have you. We don't have to identify with the party to engage in shaping public policy. I find a lot of people shy away from involvement in public policy, civic engagement, because they say, oh, I don't like the political process, it's messy. That's true, it is messy. My husband was a diehard Democrat, and I invited him to go to a political Republican caucus with me one morning, sponsored by Alana. I said, you'll meet some good Republicans and you'll get a good breakfast. He said, I agree about the good breakfast, but a good Republican, that's an oxymoron. He said, and he went, and he enjoyed it thoroughly, but he was a diehard Democrat, and he let everybody know it. I'm not partisan enough to do any party any good. I like to criticize all of them. All right. And choose the best. That's the way I tell people, because I've been involved in so many situations where I couldn't identify with a party, and I'm involved in something in Washington right now where I have to declare that I'm bipartisan, nonpartisan, but multi-partisan, not one party. I can't do that. But don't abstain because you think politics is dirty or bad or offensive. It might be, but public policy is important, and we can't get it except through that process.
Yeah, I know.
And that's a great way to leave us today, that we need to be continuing on with discussions about this. This is no way enough time to really get to the meat of this, and the history that was given to us today, the experiences, is invaluable. So I hope that you all will spend some time getting to know these folks a little bit after, as we straighten up the room. We thank you for coming tonight and hope to see you again.